Industries regularly see icons rise to prominence, but with the gaming industry traditionally attracting the archetypal gaming nerd, we've sometimes lacked standout personalities, with many typically preferring to focus on their games rather than engage with the press. With the internet, social media and YouTube all gaining prominence in the early 2000s, and of course the growing popularity and relevance of gaming, we began to see game devs become icons. Whether the enigmatic auteur, Hideo Kojima, the seemingly infallible Gabe Newell, or the hyperbolic dreamer, Peter Molyneux, game devs were suddenly finding themselves almost as popular as their games. CliffyB Bleszinski was probably one of the best suited to the new demands of the role. Not only an accomplished and innovative creative in the field, his charisma and approachable demeanour made him a favourite among American media, raising the profile of him and his games. So why was he such a success during this time? Were his games as good as his media appearances? And what's he been up to more recently? Cliff Bleszinski was born in Massachusetts in 1975, but you're not really here to hear about his childhood, so let's fast forward a bit. The year is 1990. The Hubble Space Telescope took off, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait triggers the first Gulf War, and a 15-year-old Cliff Bleszinski starts work on his first game, The Palace of Deceit. Released in 1991 when Cliff was only 16 years old, the game was a text adventure in which the player plays a man from the future who is transported to the medieval past. A year later, Cliff found himself working at Epic, having submitted his own game Dare to Dream to the company's CEO. His first title at Epic would be the platformer Jazz Jackrabbit. Released in 1994, the game would become Epic's biggest selling title, and thanks to this success, Cliff would be able to buy his first apartment and car. As someone who played Jazz Jackrabbit and the sequel, I really hope this classic gets a remake or a follow-up, but I'm kind of glad that Jazz Jackrabbit 3, a 3D game developed at the end of the 90s, was cancelled. Let's face it, few 2D platformers make this successful jump to 3D. For every great Mario game, there's a handful of failed Sonics. Back to CliffyB, after the green hair, he would find himself working on Unreal, later Unreal Tournament, one of, if not the biggest arena shooters of all time. Bleszinski also found himself working as a creative consultant on another much-loved classic, Ruin. A 25-year-old Cliff was firmly established as an industry gem, young, charismatic, and a track record of massively successful games, just as the industry was starting to break into the mainstream. By the year 2000, PC Gamer had featured him on the cover, calling him one of the next game gods. It was his next project that would launch his career into a stratosphere. Launched on the Xbox 360 in 2006, Gears of War became an instant success. A third-person shooter with a focus on cover-based combat, intense camera movement, and brutal executions. The game's tone, story, and gameplay were perfectly at home in the early 2000s. Whilst the cover-style gameplay was not unique, Gears certainly popularised the mechanic, and you can probably blame Cliffy and the Gears team for the abundance of chest-high walls and crates in modern games. The game itself started life as part of the Unreal universe, but after being inspired by Resident Evil 4, Kill Switch, and Bionic Commando, the game would shift from first-person to third-person and find its own legs. The game would still run on a modified version of Unreal Engine 3, the same engine that would power a huge number of games from this era, from the Batman Arkham games, Bioshock Infinite, and Borderlands, through to less obvious titles such as Life is Strange and Fable. The game was also perfectly timed for Microsoft. A strong visual identity and popular multiplayer made it a huge asset when marketing the 360 and Xbox Live. Naturally, with this huge success and marketing push from Microsoft, CliffyB found himself frequently involved with press and marketing materials, raising his own profile in a rapidly growing industry. In 2009, he'd be named one of the top 100 game creators of all time by IGN. A natural fit for the culture of the time, Cliff embraced his popularity and leaned in, featuring in numerous Mega 64 skits, Jake and Amir, and Video Game High School. He also crossed over into traditional media, being profiled by The New Yorker and appearing on NBC's Late Night with Jimmy Fallon. Bleszinski would oversee the next two Gears of War titles, also contributing to Shadow Complex and Bulletstorm, all whilst reaching heights of notoriety probably unthinkable a decade ago. After 20 years with Epic, Bleszinski would announce his departure in 2012, saying he wanted a break. I have to confess, I've struggled to keep up with the Gears games since that initial trilogy, but those games were much deeper than the initial gritty meathead aesthetic might suggest. Many gamers look back at those games as gems of their generation. and the series seems to remain successful to this day. In a later interview, Cliff stated his original intention was to retire for good, due to a combination of gamers feeling jaded, as well as working with some very talented people who were also very jaded, claiming, "I could pitch the most amazing idea to anybody back when I was at Epic toward the end, and they'd be like, I don't buy it." That said, before he left, Cliff would take to the stage of the Spike Video Game Awards as the design director of Epic to announce Fortnite. But the high cost of development had seen a shift towards the expansions and cosmetics we've become ever more familiar with, something Cliff seemingly struggled with. Tencent also bought a large share in Epic, and it's widely accepted that this played at least some role in Bleszinski's departure, as Tencent pushed game development to focus on pulling in large sums of cash. Fortnite didn't really fit that model at the time, and it would be a long time and Cliffy's departure until we would see the game that we're familiar with appear. Eventually, in 2014, Cliff took to Twitter to announce he was coming out of retirement to make video games again. A week later, he unveiled a free-to-play arena shooter codenamed Blue Streak, which would be developed by his new studio, Boss Key Productions. The game would later be released as Lawbreakers, but much to the dismay of his fans, the game would not make it to the Xbox, instead remaining exclusive to the PC and PlayStation. The game received favourable reviews, but failed to gain a player base. At the time of the release in 2017, the Xbox was still considered to have a more active multiplayer shooter player base, and the decision not to release the title on the Xbox was widely criticised. In later interviews, Cliff himself would admit he regretted this decision. By 2018, the announcement was made that the game hadn't made enough money to fund its continued support. The servers would close, and Boss Key would dissolve. Having opened 2 bars in Raleigh, North Carolina, he certainly had plenty to be getting on with in the meantime. But after the closure of Boss Key, Cliff got involved with theatre production, investing in and co-producing Hadestown, among other productions. Cliff would express an interest in rejoining the Gears series as an advisor. Unfortunately, the team wouldn't take him up on the offer. In 2022, Bleszinski would release his memoir, Control Freak, My Epic Adventure Making Video Games. And in 2023, he announced he was writing a comic book series, Scrapper. The comic would follow the adventures of Good Boy, Scrapper, and his buddy Tank. He also teased a sequel to Lawbreakers, 5 years after its wind-up, but as of yet there's been no further news about a return to this, or any other video game development. In the meantime, he appears to be living his best life with his wife Lauren, and whilst his Twitter/X seems to have been left to rot like most sane folk, his Instagram shows he's still got the same outspoken, maybe slightly juvenile humour. My favourite kind, honestly. Whilst we should never say never, it seems unlikely that we'll see CliffyB return. That said, with a catalogue of games this good, it's safe to say he's already cemented himself firmly into the Gaming Hall of Fame.